Welcome once again to Dialogue on Public Issues. John Channing with Campbellsville University. And today I'm very proud to be interviewing a former student that I had the pleasure of teaching many years ago, and a graduate of Campbellsville University, and the current president of the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce, Mrs. Ashley Watts.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Ashley, welcome.
Thanks. Always wonderful to be back on campus.
Well,
feels like home.
We are so proud of you as one of our distinguished alums, and I take just a little bit of pride because you did sit in a few of the classes that I was honored to teach. Did you have Max Wise as well?
I did. I had Max for a couple years, so it's been really neat as he's, a state senator, and I've been a lobbyist the last 8 years. We actually have passed bills together, and so I said it's kind of neat to have learned kind of the art of the process from him, and then actually see how legislation is passed as the lobbyist on one of his bills. So it's been really neat to have him in Frankfort.
And I think some of the classes we had together, we went to Frankfort.
We did.
On occasion.
We did. My mom was actually boxing up some stuff this weekend. She moved and she brought me a box of pictures, and I found a picture of our class in Frankfort, and actually had the house gallery pass where we'd sit up in the gallery.
Okay.
So from, I think, 2002 or 2003.
That sounds about right.
Several years ago.
Yes. Well, it's great to have you back with us. Congratulations on your recent selection to serve as president. What is the role of the president of the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce, and why did you decide to pursue that position?
So the Kentucky Chamber is the largest business association in the state. We represent thousands of businesses from all across Kentucky, east to west, north to south. The majority of our members are actually small businesses with less than 100 employees. And our primary focus for being is advocacy. That's the reason we exist. That's the reason that we are there for as many years as we've been there, is that we want to be the eyes and ears of business in Frankfort and in Washington, D.C. So we hold lots of events throughout the year. We have professional seminars. We have a nonprofit foundation which does a lot of great work. But when we survey our membership every single year, this past summer, over 90% said they are members of the Kentucky Chamber and pay their dues because of our work with advocacy.
Now, you have been with the Chamber for quite some time. Tell us a little bit about that background.
Yes, I started with the Chamber about 7.5 years ago, and really I said it's kind of an accidental career. As you know, I've always liked government and politics, and that's been my entire career. And I started off as an intern with the legislature back in 2004, and I joke I went to the Capitol and I pretty much never left. I've been there most of my career. But actually I had just had my first child, so almost 8 years ago, and I was on maternity leave. And I said, well, I've been in this career, I've been at the job, I was at the Bar Association for several years. I was kind of looking for something more, a little bit different. And so I literally just saw a job posting for the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce and thought that sounded interesting. And I applied, I think, old school, online, sent in my resume, went through a couple interviews, and then got a job as a manager of public affairs, a lobbyist, about 8 years ago. And through luck and hard work, I had a couple people ahead of me that went on to pursue other ventures, and a lot of hard work. Back in November of 2019, I was named president and CEO. Our past president, Dave Atkinson, had been there for 15 years, and he had decided it was time to retire. And so they did a nationwide search. It lasted about 8 months. It seemed like a very long 8 months when I was going through the process, but luckily at the end of the day they did come back home and hired me. At that point I was serving as senior vice president of public affairs, overseeing all lobbying and all advocacy at the association. So it's been a fun couple months.
I wouldn't expect you to state what I'm going to say, but my sources tell me this was a very challenging, intensive process, and that you competed against some heavyweight, so to speak, contenders, both from Kentucky as well as from around the nation.
That's true, and actually I would agree with it. During the entire process, I just kept saying to myself, I'm right here. I mean, I've been doing this job for over 7 years. Why are we doing this whole search? And honestly, at the end of the day, once I went through the process, and was selected. I am so grateful that I did go through that process, because I think at the end of the day, I was put up against everyone else from within the state and nationally. And luckily, I think it does validate me. So going into it, I don't think I was just seen as Dave's kind of mentee that he brought up, but I was representing myself and could prove that I could do the job. So I'm very grateful for, as long as sometimes as tense as the process was, that I did go through that process. I think it prepared me in a way that I would not have been if they had just selected me from internally.
How do you balance what we see you on television quite often? You're an frequent guest on Kentucky Tonight on Monday evenings when there are issues being discussed and so forth on KET. You're a wife, you're a mother, active in your church at First United Methodist in Lexington, or Frankfort, excuse me. How do you combine all this and get it done?
People ask that a lot, and I think, you know, I'm the first female president of the Kentucky Chamber. I am the youngest president of the Kentucky Chamber, and so that's been a question that's been posed a lot, is the question of work-life balance. And I don't know if I do a great job with it. I think really, for me, it's not so much of a balance as it is an integration. So pretty much I am on both at all times of the day. And so last week, for example, I did a radio show in Louisville, and I decided to bring my daughter with me. I was like, that's something that she can come with me to. And so she had a fun time. She actually got to be on the radio for a minute. And there are some times at night where, you know, they're getting ready for bed, and I have to knock out some emails or take a conference call. So I think I kind of just do the best I can, but I do say, I know it's cliche, the saying it takes a village, but for me it really does. My husband also runs a statewide association, and so we are pretty busy. So we're lucky to have family. My mother helps a lot, friends, a good school network, and so really it's kind of day by day, but I do think it's pretty neat when I start feeling that little bit of mom guilt of if I've missed something or I should be more attentive in this respect, that I do think my kids have a role model to look up to, but someone who worked really hard and pretty much did all of this on her own. And so I think that kind of balances in my mind when I kind of start feeling that mom guilt.
Sounds like, and I know from you, having known you since your college days and the work ethic you displayed on campus, no doubt you're doing well putting the two. It's not an either or. It's fully integrated in terms of your life. What are some of the current major initiatives of the Kentucky Chamber?
So we're in the middle of a legislative session. I think we're about actually a third of the way through. And so policy advocacy is what we do at the Chamber. And I've been saying the last couple months, if I had one big wish, if I had one big ask for this session, it would be to increase infrastructure investment. So right now, we do not have enough money to even maintain our current roads and bridges system, much less expand or build anything new. And usually when we talk about infrastructure, I said for businesses, for economic development, it's apple pie. I mean, it's the thing that almost everyone agrees on you have to have. You ask any business what they look at when coming to Kentucky or deciding to locate or even to stay in Kentucky, and at the top of their list almost every time it's infrastructure. And we're home to Amazon and UPS and DHL and Ford and Toyota, and we're kind of this logistics hub, transportation hub, and I think it's really important that we don't lose momentum in the field of economic development. We have made a lot of progress the last couple of years with a better tax climate, reforming our workers' comp system, and all of these things that help business come to Kentucky. But if we don't invest in our infrastructure this year, we will quickly fall behind. If you look at a map of Kentucky with all the surrounding states, most of which are red Republican states, in the last couple of years, all of these states have increased their gas tax, and Kentucky has not. So it really isn't a partisan issue at all. It's just something that we really need to invest in our future. So that's my big ask this session, is infrastructure. We're also looking at a lot of criminal justice reform efforts. We're also working, and this may not be popular in Campbellsville, we're working on the sports wagering bill. That's kind of a no-brainer for our businesses when we poll them. And then, you know, we're always looking at education. I think when you look at the Kentucky Chamber and look at the business community, our top strategic priority has always been and will always be education. We know that is the key to our prosperity in Kentucky. So we're working on a couple education bills as well. But transportation infrastructure is kind of my big ask this session.
In terms of infrastructure, obviously you touched upon the elephant in the room, so to speak, and that is funding.
Right.
The inadequacy of the current revenue stream supporting, in particular, our roads and bridges. And of course, infrastructure goes beyond that.
It does, absolutely.
In terms of wastewater and drinking water, et cetera. But the roads and bridges are literally crumbling before us. And that's not even to mention the needed new roads and bridges that we need to be competitive and to move our transportation and goods to market, et cetera. So what is your reading?
So it's the
what's your reading on increasing the gas tax?
So we want to increase the gas tax. We also want to increase some fees when you register vehicles that may have a better gas mileage. Some may call them electric or hybrid, but the bill that we think will be proposed will have almost a sliding scale of if your car gets 0 to 20 miles per gallon, you would pay this, then it would go up because the cars are driving on the roads just as much as other cars, but they're not paying kind of into the tax system. It's always been a very bipartisan issue. Every time we've worked on this issue, it's passed overwhelmingly with bipartisan support because every legislator wants their road, wants their highway, wants their bypass, Heartland Parkway, whatever it may be.
Indeed.
And it really is, going back to kind of a basic business tax analogy, it's a consumption-based tax. You know what you are getting, you see the results in it. So it's not, I'm not going to say it's an easy vote, but I do think there's enough groundswell support. The coalition consists of the cities and the mayors, the county judges, Farm Bureau, school boards. There's a broad coalition that really want to see it done this session. So I do think there is a possibility. It could be one of those things that's done the last couple of days, maybe, even in the last couple of hours. But I do think the support is so strong on both sides of the aisle that there is a good likelihood it will pass.
Has the leadership of the House and the Senate opined on it as yet? Have they said yes or no, or are they reserving public comment?
They're kind of reserving public comment for right now. We have probably talked their ears off about this issue. I do think there tends to be a general sense of agreement of we do need additional revenue in the road fund. Sometimes how you get there, how that sausage is made, is what kind of takes up the time. It's also an election year, so making sure that it has bipartisan support, I think, is very important. So that's what we're kind of working through right now. The last time I worked on this issue, I think, was in 2015, and the bill passed, I believe, right at midnight on the very last day of session. So really, unfortunately, I would love to have it resolved and cleared up right now, but it probably will be one of those issues dealing with taxes and revenue that is probably going to be in the last couple days of session.
How is a gas tax seen in the legislature by many of those who have run on a non-tax increase? They've signed the pledge. They've signed the pledge.
We always encourage people, don't ever sign the pledge.
Well,
you get yourself in a box.
That's good advice, I would suggest.
And the chamber doesn't sit here most of the time and advocate for new taxes.
Right.
But on things like the gas tax or increasing the cigarette tax, there's a very good business case to do so. So, we actually looked at a study because we knew this was going to be an issue. It's an election year. How has it affected other candidates that have run for office that have taken this vote? And when you have all the states around you that have taken this vote, you can usually find this out.
Right.
So we actually looked at a study that really no one has lost their seat in the state legislature for taking this vote. It just hasn't happened. There may be other tax issues or another issue that has brought them down, but when you look at what voters vote on when they go to that ballot box in November and push a button, it really is not the gas tax.
Has the governor indicated his support?
He has given his general support in many statements. I think, again, it's kind of how it's going to be done and how much the tax would be, kind of what the oversight looks like is a conversation right now. But he has given his general support for the issue.
Now, you mentioned in terms of education, what specifically is the chamber looking for in this session in the area of education policy?
So the big ask right now, of course, it's a budget year. And so the governor put forth his budget a couple weeks ago, and now it's up to the House to kind of tweak or craft their own budget. And really what we're encouraging is funding for education. And so the chamber recently released a report called the Leaky Bucket Report. We released our first one 10 years ago, and so it was time to do kind of a 10-year update, a checkup of sorts. And so basically the analogy is if the state budget was a bucket, there are three major holes, three things that are growing at a much faster rate, spending more money than the rest of the state budget. And these three things were pensions, corrections, and Medicaid. That was 10 years ago. Unfortunately, 10 years later, we still have three major leaks: pensions, corrections, and Medicaid. And when you're spending this kind of money every time a new prison is built or Medicaid spending goes up, that just simply takes away from what I think we all can agree is our top priority, which is education. And the most startling chart in the report to me, and I think it would be to anyone that reads it, is looking at post-secondary funding for education. And in the last 10 years, it has dropped almost 15%. We also compare it to all the other states in the United States where post-secondary education has increased. And I think in Tennessee, our neighboring state, it's increased 33%, and Kentucky has dropped almost 15%. And so that really is unacceptable. So you look at higher education, you look at why tuition is increasing, and it's a pretty easy equation when you look at the funding has been cut that much. So we are really encouraging funding of higher education. I know the governor put forth, I think, a 1% bump in higher education. We're also looking at funding for preschool, for early childhood programs, and really for education as a whole, and to make sure that our budget is an investment document, not just a document that patches up where we need work. And that does take, sometimes new revenue, and that's what we've called for. We have called for new revenue to make sure education is fully funding. So funding is the main piece of what we're calling for this session.
Has the chamber articulated where that revenue should come from?
We've made several suggestions, and much of them aligned with what the governor laid out, actually. One is sports wagering.
Right.
We poll our membership every year on this, and it was overwhelmingly positive in favor of sports wagering. We think it'll bring in about $20 million a year. Not enough to fix the pension problem by any means, but a little extra money in the state coffer. We also propose raising the cigarette tax. So a problem Kentucky has with workforce is that we have one of the unhealthiest workforces in the nation. And that really is simply because we smoke too much. We have one of the highest levels of smoking in the nation. So we could increase our cigarette tax by 50 additional cents and still be less than the national average. The governor proposed 10 cents. We think it should be at least 50. So that's a pretty good chunk right there. So there are several ways that we really could increase revenue. Vaping tax. Right now, our tax climate really hasn't caught up to the vaping epidemic. And so we think that vaping devices should be taxed at the same rate as regular tobacco. So there are several pieces of the pie that we think are actually pretty bipartisan that you could achieve some additional revenue this session for education.
Does the chamber believe that there's any likelihood of true tax reform in the near future? We've had tweaks during the last session or two. Former Governor Steve Beshear had a commission. The study is now one of many lying in the shelves.
Exactly right,
Archives, the state government. Everybody running for governor was for tax reform, depending on their ideology or perspective. From the chamber's perspective, is there a need for tax reform? And secondly, is there a realistic chance for tax reform as supported by the chamber?
By the business community. There absolutely is a need for it. And we do commend the legislature the last couple of years. They have made some tax changes. I wouldn't call it broad-based reform, but I think they were slowly trying to get their way to what we would call a consumption-based tax system. So if you look at Tennessee, they have no income tax and a higher sales tax. So you're taxing your spending, not necessarily your production. And that really is, as the business community would tell you, the way that they would prefer things go. And we made some strides to go in that direction the last couple of years. We've raised the cigarette tax. It's kind of been a little bit of a patchwork of what we've done with the tax system. It's also increased some revenue, which is good. We do think that any broad-based tax reform should increase revenue. And people say, can you do it being business friendly? And the answer is absolutely. You look at states like North Carolina, and a couple of years ago, their Chamber of Commerce led kind of a year-long study, much like has been done with Kentucky in the past. They brought in the nonpartisan tax foundation from the national level, kind of did an in-depth study, and they were able to bring in significant revenue, but make their tax code more business-friendly. So that's the way we would like to see it, kind of having stakeholders brought to the table, look at what's out there, see what we can do. We cannot kind of flip a switch and all of a sudden get rid of our income tax and raise sales tax. but there are ways to kind of slowly do that. Is that a reality this session or really in the next couple of years? I'm a little doubtful. I do think we're all kind of figuring out this new reality of having a Democratic governor and having a supermajority Republican legislature. And so the Republican legislature can pass kind of whatever they would want, and they have enough votes to override anything the governor did not like and would veto. But the reality of tax reform and really some of these bigger issues is that typically the governor leads on them. The governor's kind of the one that gets out in front, sets the path, and the legislature kind of forms the agenda and the policy around it. So I do think among the legislature there is hope for additional tax reform. I don't know if that's going to be a reality in kind of the divided government we're living in. I do think there could be some tweaks to local government tax reform. Not all localities have the ability to do a restaurant tax, which usually goes to economic development. So I do think that could be a possibility. So we'll kind of have to see if some things can be done around the edges with the cigarette tax or the vaping tax, restaurant tax. But an overall discussion of, hey, let's really tackle tax reform, it's not something we've been hearing in the recent months.
Is there much support for what I would call a local sales tax, a discretionary local sales tax?
I think there is. You know, a couple of years ago, we did favor the local option sales tax initiative, which basically said if a local government came together and had a designated project that would benefit their community, it would go to the tax base, the voter base, to vote on that. And then after it was paid off, that extra penny or two on the sales tax would then sunset. It's a little different now. Now more and more localities are talking about a restaurant tax. And I don't know if Campbellsville has a restaurant tax or not. I don't think you guys do. I don't think you have the ability to do so.
I don't think so.
So some cities do have the ability. I'm originally from Elizabethtown. And so I know a couple years ago they were able to put forth a 2-penny restaurant tax that went to build their sports park. And I've asked the Hardin County Chamber of Commerce and Elizabethtown officials, what has made E-Town kind of boom? And I left there in 2000, but I still have family there, and it's a different place than it was 20 years ago. And I thought, well, you know, it is on 65, it's near Fort Knox, it went wet. There are all these things that do lend itself to good economic development policies. And every single person says it's the restaurant tax. They were able to build the sports park, which had a flood of people coming in on the weekends, who then ate out, who then stayed in the hotels, who went shopping. And basically, we kind of polled our membership. We talked to our local chambers. There's 82 across the state. And they all want that ability to say, let us try to set our own destiny. And if the people of Campbellsville would want to do a 1 or 2 penny restaurant tax to do a designated project within their community, they should have the availability to do so. So I do think there's kind of a groundswell for kind of that local tax initiative.
One thing, backing up to your prior response, you mentioned that it's not transitioning from a income tax system to a consumer tax system is not just flipping a switch.
You can't do that.
The states that have tried that, such as Kansas, Kansas is the model for that. It's been a disaster.
It has been.
And a lot of political repercussions have been experienced there, and the state nearly went bankrupt and so forth. And so I think that's a good point to be put out into the public domain for. That's an example of how not to do it, probably.
You're exactly right. And when we kind of have debates on tax reform, and I'm obviously on the business-friendly side of tax reform, people on the other side say, well, look at Kansas. We have never advocated for that. We really have advocated for a system, much like North Carolina, where they led kind of a big effort, had stakeholders brought to the table, outside tax experts, and they've done it in the right way, and their tax climate has greatly improved.
The Chamber has also been engaged through the years and more intentionally in the last year or so on workforce development initiatives, and that has kind of a Campbellsville connection. What are you doing there, and what are some of the proposed outcomes of that effort?
So I would say probably about 4 years ago, we started hearing from every single business we talked to, no matter it was a small business, a large business, no matter what sector, that the number one issue they had was workforce, finding qualified workers, and also matching the workforce they had up with the skills that they needed. And so we started kind of toying around with having a workforce center. And we partnered with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. They have a system called Talent Pipeline Management that they have kind of tried to push throughout the states that basically does just that. They try to find sectors of employers, figure out what needs they need, work together, and then work with the education system to make sure those needs are being met. And so we were able to get some grant funding through and it goes through our foundation. And so we're now, I think, year 2 of our Workforce Center. We went from a staff of 1 to, I think, a staff 9. And our chair is Michael Rodenberg here in Campbellsville with Murakami. And he has been very invested in this project. And so it really has been a great member benefit that our members can see that we're really tackling the workforce program. We really are partnering with the state. It's a public-private partnership with the Education and Workforce Cabinet. So we have private donations, we have state donations, but we have hundreds of employers throughout the state that in many times see themselves as competitors, but for this effort, they're coming together by sectors, figuring out what they need, and then working with the education system, the KCTCS system, et cetera, to make sure those needs will be met.
Related to that, to an extent, is the recently, within the last year, launched effort on creating dialogue and collaboration on this critical problem, emergency crisis problem on opioid addiction and the relationship that has into the business community and the economy. Comment on that.
It really has, and I think 5-10 years ago, many of us probably saw the opioid crisis as a public health crisis, not really a business issue.
Right.
And recently, I'd say in the last 3 or 4 years, it has come to the forefront of almost every employer in Kentucky is dealing with it in some aspect, whether they can't find applicants that are drug-free or they have someone who's been a great employee for many years and all of a sudden a drug test shows up, positive. And so how are employers dealing with this? And that's what we just kept hearing. And so we actually partnered with the state again through the Justice and Public Safety Cabinet and decided to have 2 full-time Kentucky Chamber employees that would go into businesses and try to look at their HR policies, see what they were doing, kind of make sure they could be recovery-friendly workplaces, and really destigmatize the issue of opioid addiction. Senator McConnell, Leader McConnell, has been very instrumental in this effort. He has passed bills on the federal level that have really helped this work to make sure that it is a business issue and that we're helping people get back to work, help them get educated, housing, transportation, all of those things that people really need to get back on the path to get on the right track. And so our chair for that is actually a Campbellsville alum, John Copley, who is president of Aetna Better Health here in Kentucky. And so we have lots of good Campbellsville connections with our Workforce Center. But this program has really gone better than probably any of us can imagine. Almost every employer in the state kind of wants to take part in it, wants to be part of the solution. And I think it's a pretty good testament of the mind shift that we've had of a couple years ago. It was probably a no tolerance zone at almost every business in Kentucky that they just didn't want to deal with it. If a drug test came up positive, you would be out and that would be it. And now employers are really pulling up a seat at the table to be part of the solution. And I think it's because everyone in Kentucky loves someone that has struggled with this addiction.
Ashley, thank you so much. We're out of time.
Wow, that went fast.
It does. It passes quickly, particularly when I have great guests like you who have a lot to offer and a lot to share. Thank you. We'll have to do this again.
Absolutely.
And by the way, for our audience, you're joining the University Board of Trustees, and I know Dr. Carter and Chairman Henry Lee and the board certainly are pleased to have you as a member.
Well, it's a great honor. I was pleased to be asked.
This is John Chowning with Ashley Smith, President and CEO of the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce. Thank you.